Okay. My name is Jim Borowitz, and we're speaking with Pete Kazura here at 280 Warburton Avenue in Hastings-on-Hudson, and it's April 19th, 1988. And well, if Mr. Kazura, we could start off by asking when and where were you born?
I was born in New York City on Houston Street in November the 20th, 1910.
Okay. And when did you come to Hastings?
I came to Hastings in 1927.
Okay, you were 17 years old. You came here to work?
I came here because I was tempted to go to work up in General Motors. I was working down in the city where I was only making about $15 a week. Up in General Motors, they were making about $35 a week. So I came up here to go to work up in General Motors, and the first day I applied for a job, they hired me.
At General Motors?
At General Motors. And that was back in 27.
Okay.
Now, I worked up there for a few years, but the way they used to work is every year they would change the model. And when they changed the model of the car, there would be a general shutdown and everybody would be laid off. So naturally you would go out looking for another job to fill in. Well, that went on for a while, and I had various other jobs until it was, I think, 1933. The Anaconda was setting up a baseball team, and I was a ball player, and I was asked to go down there and play ball for the Anaconda. In the meantime, they were giving me a job. So that's the way I started in Anaconda. I expected to work there just for the summer, while I was playing ball, but I wound up working there 40 years.
Okay, you were 23 then when you started.
That's right.
And what did you do?
When I first started down there, I was just given a general job I drove a crane, I drove cars, trucks, and did various other work, painting, until that went on for a while. And then again, the money situation came up, and I wanted a better job, so I asked for a transfer to go from the general work in the Anaconda, which was more or less just floor work and whatever was needed as a maintenance man. I went to work on a taping machine, which was paper insulated cable. Anaconda made paper insulated cable, and its biggest customer was Con Edison. And that job paid, I believe, 60 cents an hour, whereas the other jobs that you were getting were about 40 cents an hour.
How long were you working there until you got the increase?
On the machines?
Yeah.
Oh, I must have been there a couple of years. But more or less I was playing ball, and when you're playing ball, we used to come in and punch our cards. Everybody used to punch a card when you went to work, and when you went home, you punched out. But when you're playing ball, we used to get in a bus, travel to other companies like Con Edison, Public Service from New Jersey. We even went up as far as Pawtucket, Rhode Island, all over to play baseball. And that was a nice life. I was single, and
How was the team?
the team we had an exceptional team. Very good team. We had a lot of college players, a lot of good semi-pro ball players, and we usually did very well. During the course of a year, we would win maybe 20 some odd games and lose maybe 3 or 4. So we always had a pretty good record. The team that beat us had to have a pretty good team. We played Sing Sing Prison, which was up in Hastings. And it was a nice, easy life. But
How about the work? Was it
the work, when I started to work at the paper insulating, or as they called it at that time, power cable, what we did is we insulated copper cable with paper.
And how was that done?
That was done by machine. And after you put a layer of, quite a few layers of paper on this here cable, it was then put into a cabling machine where these conductors, they would take 3 conductors and twist them into a cable, and then put it in oil, impregnate it with oil under pressure, put a coat, a layer of lead over the top of it, and then was used primarily down in New York for all their power cables by Con Edison.
Would that be high voltage cable?
At that time, yes, high voltage cable and other low voltage cables. They had both. And that's still on. Shut it off for a minute, then we'll pick it up again.
Well, I'd rather not.
Oh, all right. All right, then let's, how long will that thing run?
Oh, we have plenty of tape.
Oh, all right. After that there, I worked on those machines, I would say that's approximately a few years. And I was then made a supervisor. I was made a foreman in the year of 1941. And I became a supervisor in that particular department. And I worked there for a few years. When the war broke out, I was transferred up to the North Mill, where we were making cables and Navy insulated cables for the Navy. And I was in charge of the North Mill section of taping department.
What percentage of that work was for the military?
Where I was working at that particular time, I would say 50% of the cable was made for the Navy. And the rest of it naturally was made for local consumption by the industries around here.
Would there be special standards for the military work?
Oh yes, definitely. They had Navy inspectors down there who constantly worked around to see that we lived up to their specifications. And it went through special Navy tests. They had a testing department where the cable was tested before it was sent out to the fields. Down in the South Mill, they were making large cables, and they had a cable that was being made to detonate floating mines. They would hook it onto a tug, and this cable would go out. It would have electric current through it, and they'd shoot the current through there, and as soon as they came close to a mine, the mine would explode. That was also made for the Navy. Well, naturally, during the war, until the end of the war, I worked in that particular department. After the war, I was transferred again as a supervisor down to the cable mill where I originally started. And there I worked in the lead room and the stranding department, and I don't want to go too far ahead of myself, but
During the war, did they hire a lot more people in order to make up for the extra?
during the war we hired a lot of women. A lot of women were working down there running machines. A lot of women were running machines. There were some of the men that were key men and that were kept, they were given deferments. They didn't have to get taken into the army, and I was one that was deferred, and that's the reason I didn't go in the army. But I was a supervisor, and I was supervising the women that were working there. They ran the machines. They ran the machines, and I just made sure that they did it according to specifications.
How did the women deal with the machines? Was it dangerous? Was there any...
No, they weren't that dangerous. They weren't given any real heavy machines to run. Some of the cables that they were more or less working on were fine wire cable. There wasn't any of the heavy stuff that I was telling you about that I worked on. They still had men working there, but they had more of the older men there. Guys that were in their 60s were working on those machines. But the women, they worked on light cables. They were made, I'm trying to gather my thoughts, what the type of cables they were making, but they were more or less field wire cables that they would run along and drop them out and use them for telephone during the battlefields. That's the cable that they were making up in the North Middle. And it was a light cable because the soldiers used to carry it. Now, I don't want to rush through the war period, but after the war, I went back to the cable mill, as I told you, and worked down there. Oh, I'm trying to piece these years together. 45 to about 50. Then I was put in charge of a reel shop that manufactured reels for the cables. We used to make up the reels. And we had a salvage department down there. I worked there, again the years. But for another 5 years. Then I was transferred to the wire mill, where I became a general foreman. And the general foreman means that you had sub-foremen working under you.
How many people did you have working for you at that time?
Oh, I must have had maybe 150 employees and approximately 3, 6, maybe 10 sub-foremen, because we operated 3 shifts. We had a continuous operation there. You'd work from 8 to 4, 4 to 12, and 12 to 8. And the other foremen used to rotate their shifts and work around the clock. One week they would work one way, the next week they'd work 4 to 12, the following week they'd work 12 to 8. And there, then I was given a job of supervising the flow of copper. We used to have our copper come in by barge from Raritan, where there was a smelting plant, an international smelting. And they would send up a barge load of copper bars that weighed approximately, they varied from 250 pounds to 300 pounds each. And then put 1 million pounds of copper on the barge. and a tug would pull it up into the Anaconda slip. I would have a crew of men unload it with heisters and cranes and place it in front of the rod mill so they could further process it and roll it into wire bars. Now the rod mill would roll it down to sizes like 3/8 of an inch or a 1/4 inch. And imagine a copper ingot, 300 pounds, being rolled, and it was about 5 inches by 6 inches wide and approximately 5 foot long. And we would roll it into a wire bar, 1/4 inch. That was always done in a rod mill. We used some of the wire bar and some of the wire was sold, just the way it was. And other people would run the wire bar and process it further. They could run it down to almost your hair size. That's how fine they could run it down. Through a series of dyes and solution, they would run this copper to the size that they would want.
What kind of companies would do that?
Smaller companies that didn't have rod mills, but they did have, they had companies in Long Island, they had companies in Connecticut. I just don't remember the names right now, but they were smaller companies that had a lot of fine wire drawing machines. And we would run this copper wire down to the size that they would require, and they would process it further, run it down to whatever size they want. And the copper was used not only for electrical purposes, they were used to make pins, they were used to make clips, or whatever other companies took it and what they used it for.
What kind of wire was the Anaconda making at that time?
We were making practically anything that the customer would require, and that is wire bars. Then we made wire cable, or what we would call strand. It would be either 7 wires, 19 wires, 37 wires, 61 wires. We would, from that copper bar, we would roll them down a different size and then strand it. Take these wires and make it into a cable, a wire cable. And that wire cable would be then brought over, originally where I worked in a paper tape, and some of it was insulated. Some of it was sold just bare copper strand, because other people had taping machines and they would do their own taping. But they just wanted the copper product.
Okay, this is post-war. About what year is this now that we're talking?
Oh, the last time now, we're getting up around, around the 70s.
Okay.
We're up around the 70s now. And I worked in the wire mill and then was transferred again back into the reel shop and the cable accessories. I had a few departments that I was in charge of. And I worked there until 72. And in 72, I retired. I had approximately 40 years in there. And I retired in 72.
How did you feel about retiring?
I felt pretty good. By that time, Jimmy, I've had my share. And as I could see that things were getting tough down in the Anaconda, They weren't replacing the old machines with new machines. We were falling behind in production. In order to be competitive, you've got to have new machines and high speeds. If you don't have new equipment, eventually you have to phase out. And I more or less give myself credit, and some other people who I knew fairly well told me that they were more or less phasing out Hastings. So I retired while I had a chance to get my pension, and I didn't know what was coming ahead. And I retired in November of '72. And I can honestly say that I've enjoyed myself the years up until now.
How about, if we could go back a little bit, during the war you said there were a lot of women were hired.
That's right.
What happened once the war was over and a lot of military contracts?
Then the women started to get phased out. And they would know more or less that when the men came back, that they would not hold the jobs. And now we weren't making that Navy cable anymore, a communication cable. We started to go back to the heavy stuff, which the women couldn't do anyway. So you needed the men to come back. And then the North Mill started up to make telephone cable. And the North Mill was making large-sized telephone cable. And a lot of the work was heavier, which was a little too heavy for the women to work on.
So were there any women that were working into the 60s and 70s?
Oh, yes. There were some women, but they weren't more or less running machines. Some were in the test department, but there wasn't too many of them. They started to phase them out pretty good. They were offered jobs as clean-up women and stuff like that, but they weren't actually operating machines.
Okay, now as it went into the 60s and early 70s, you say that it was phasing out. Were there people losing jobs?
No, the women were. They were offered other alternatives, such as jobs actually that some of them didn't want. And as soon as they saw what was going on, a lot of the women quit themselves and went looking for other jobs because they knew the men were coming back, and a lot of the men that were in the service came back and took their jobs. This is not in the 60s. This was now, you can go back to 45 when the war was over, and by 50, most of the women were gone.
What kind of company was the Anaconda for a woman to work for? Was it a good company?
Well, for a woman, they were getting the same pay as the men were getting. There was no differential in the pay. Anaconda was never a high-paying job. When I started work down there, the pay was 36 cents an hour. You worked 40 hours and got $14.40. Then when the NRA came in, they had to raise it to 40 cents an hour. And then, as I said, I went to the paper tape, and in the paper tape they were making 60 cents an hour, but it was a little more technical work than what you were doing on other jobs.
How about minorities in the Anaconda?
There wasn't too many colored. There wasn't too many colored. Outside of that, ethnic people, you had everything in there. You had the Russians, the Poles, the Italians, the Irish. But there wasn't too many women until the war started. When the war started, then a lot of women went down there, because the men weren't around.
How about the workers? How did they get along working at the plant?
I think the workers more or less were treated fairly well. As I said, the pay wasn't too high, but neither was the other areas around here paying much higher. And once a fella put in 10, 15 like me, after I had 20 years in there, I wasn't thinking no more of going somewhere else because I didn't want to give up my benefits that I had there. So that's why I kept on working there. And as I said, I became a supervisor, and naturally, when you become a supervisor, your pay gets increased, and increase by increase, I looked around at what somebody else was doing, and here I was living in Hastings and commuting to Anaconda. I was down at work at 5 minutes.
You mentioned the baseball. How long did you play with the company team?
I played as long as we had a team, and the baseball started around 34 and went up to the time of the war, which was in 40. Now, naturally, when the men went into the service, baseball went flat. There was no more baseball teams. There were no more baseball teams, but prior to that time, almost every different industry had a baseball team representing them. And on we'd play Saturdays and Sundays. People would come up from the village and sit up there and spend a pleasant afternoon watching a ball game.
How did that bring a lot of people that worked there together?
They brought them together some, but everyone had their own thing. At that time, people were great for picnicking, fishing, swimming. Even though the river was supposed to be polluted, a lot of people were swimming in the Hudson River, pollution or not. And when you're not making a lot of money, you find ways to entertain yourself with stuff that doesn't cost much. So a picnic, watching a ball game, or fishing, that don't cost much, and that's what the people were doing. When money became a little more freely, everybody got a car. Everybody didn't have a car then. Money got a little freer, people started to buy cars, and baseball, now you go to watch, unless you watch a professional baseball team, very few. We have Little League. I was connected with the Little League. And very seldom would we have, even though the children, you remember when you played Little League, didn't you? How many people would watch a ball game? 20 or 30? That's about all. They wouldn't even watch their own kids play, some of the people. They just bring them up there and let you act as a babysitter for them when they would go about their business.
And back then in the 30s, it was a big event.
Oh, baseball was a big event. We'd have a couple of hundred people up at the ball game.
Where did you play?
Up at Reynolds Field. And as I told you, we traveled. Traveling was nice. We used to travel by boat. We used to go down to pick up a boat at the Colonial Line and go up to Pawtucket by boat. That was a pleasant trip. And go up there, play a ball game, and come back by boat. And we went to Jersey, we traveled by bus. Get in a bus, travel out there, and they would take us to lunch. After the ball game, take us to dinner. We'd come home, put our uniforms away, and go home. The next day, we would come back and take our respective jobs, whatever they were at that particular time.
I think we're getting near the end of the tape. I'm going to
All right.
put it to the end.
Answer them the best I can.
Okay. You mentioned the people swimming in the river, and you said it might have been polluted. Was the Anaconda involved in polluting the river at all?
No, this was the village people. They would get down there, bring some lunches, bring hot dogs down there, or hamburgers, and have a hibachi, sit around there, and swim. We didn't have any beaches. We had the place they used to call a point, which was beyond what the Tower Ridge Yacht Club is, right beyond there, and a lot of people would gather down there and go swimming, have a little picnic outside.
Where did that pollution come from that people
Oh,
were
the
worried
pollution.
about?
At one time, Every industry along here was guilty of polluting. Anaconda was too. They would take their copper dust or stuff like that. The sewers used to drain into the Hudson River. And all that pollution would go into the Hudson River. When they started to put restrictions on there, that's when the river started to clean up. I would say the river now is as clean as I've seen it in the 70 years.
Really? How did those restrictions affect the Anaconda, affect the work there?
They had to make provisions to take their copper shavings. Instead of it going into the river, they started to make sluways where they would capture this here. And it turned out that they would make better off by doing that there, because what they would do is capture these copper shavings that were made while they were drawing the wire in the rod mill. There'd be certain small bits of copper particles would come off the rods as they were rolled. And they would capture that now and put them into barrels, and then they were selling that as copper. So, and of course, like you had the other industries, they had dyes and acids and stuff like that, which was being dumped into the river. And that's what really polluted that river. They had the pavement company, Hastings Pavement Company down there. The tar and the ingredients that used to come off them blocks they used to make all went into the river. That's what killed that river. There was good fishing there for quite a while. The fish couldn't take it. And then when the United States government decided to clean up the river.
When was that about?
Oh, I would say that can't be too far back. That's 20 years back. I would say they started to clean up this river. I think who was responsible was our senator at that time. Oh, what was his name? I can't think of his name right now, but they went up and down and had inspectors go along, and if they found any industry that was polluting, they would fine them, and stiff fines, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And naturally, when you get fined that heavy, people started to clean up their waste.
And the Anaconda was concerned mainly with the copper dust?
Copper, and also different solutions, like wire. When you draw copper wire, you've got to use fat and soap, and some of that there stuff, when it would spill over, would spill into the river, and nobody ever cared about it too much until the government got tough. And when the government got tough, everybody had to clean up their act. So they all made provisions to capture all that stuff. Instead of going out to the river, they would capture it and get rid of it other ways.
The machinery that you operated, I asked before whether it was dangerous or anything. Were there any accidents or anything that would interrupt work there?
Oh yeah. Naturally, when you're working there, they had a safety program down there. Used to have safety meetings, tell people to wear clothes that were more or less befitting to the job, not to wear loose clothing. There were accidents down there, and people did get hurt down there. In fact, while I was down there, one fella got killed down there. He was running what we called a bunching machine. They used to take these fine wires and twist them up into a cable. And it was a spinning cycle that the wires used to feed into this machine, and it had a cover on it so that you couldn't get hurt. But this one particular fella lifted the cover as the machine was running, and he had a necktie on. And as he leaned over, the machine that was rotating at about 1,000 RPMs per minute caught his necktie and pulled him into the machine. And it just cut him right down to his chest. I know there was fellas that had accidents with equipment, but a lot of it was due more or less to carelessness and people not watching what they were doing.
Now, as a foreman, what was your responsibility? You had a lot of meetings, you trained people.
We trained people. We try to get production, naturally. Production is the lifeline of any industry. So you had to see that the proper methods were used, that you received good quality material, that the stuff that was put out was usable and saleable, because stuff that wasn't up to standard, those barges that used to come up with copper bars, anything that was scrapped would go back on that barge, back to the refinery, and that was refined and turned back into copper bars. So we tried to keep our scrap down. Scrap was very important. Everybody was responsible to keep the scrap down in their department.
Who would test that copper to see if it was refined enough?
The foreman on the job, the sub-foreman, and the fellas that were operating the machines. Everybody had to be an inspector, and we also had inspectors that went around the plant inspecting the work as it was in progress. And if it wasn't up to standard, they would put a stop tag on that particular thing, and then you would determine whether it was usable or whether it was scrap. And if it was scrap, there's no sense of processing it any further. We would cut it out and scrap it and start it all over again.
Whose responsibility was that scrap then? The company that sold you the...
Oh, no. It was all, anything that was scrapped in Anaconda was Anaconda's...
Their own property.
Their property, and it was your fault for scrapping it. It had to be either the operator's fault for not operating his machine properly, or he was given defective material to work with, which was passed down from another department. So everybody had to check as they went along. The operator, the sub-foreman, the foreman, everybody made periodic checks on the material that was being run.
The inspectors that came around, were they your supervisor?
Yes, they were. They were hired by the Anaconda, except during the war. During the war, I told you they had Navy inspectors. They came from the Navy Department.
Now, what kind of education did those people have? Were they college people?
There weren't too many college people down there. Most of the college people, when they came in there, when I found out, they either went into the technical departments, engineering departments. Very few of them wound up in a mill. Very few college men. The college guys that did come out, they were technical engineers that would become a head of a department. What else you want to know?
Well, your boss, say, what was your relationship with him? How often did you see him?
I saw him every day, just as my supervisor saw me every day, or quite a few times. I would circulate around and make sure that everything was running according to the way it's supposed to be. There was nothing being done that shouldn't be done. Watch out for safety and make sure that the men were doing their work.
Was there incentives?
Yes, there were. We had an incentive plan. If you exceeded your amount, they had incentives, and they would give you the additional bonus.
What would that consist of? They would give cash?
Oh no, what? You had time tickets to make out. At the end of the day, you would have to fill out your time ticket as to what you produced. Now there were certain standards that you had to meet, what we called was standard production. Now if you exceeded standard production, there were rates that would give you, the more you made and it was good quality, you would get paid more for it, which was figured out by our time keepers and our industrial department. That's where your college boys were up there. They were industrial engineers.
Okay, then it was, you could get paid proportional to the quality of work.
Well, you had a standard rate that you had to get so much, a base pay. Now, if you exceeded your base work, you would get a bonus.
As a foreman then, what incentive did you have?
My incentive was if I made good production, periodically they would study my record and they would give me an increase in pay. I had nothing to do with incentive rates for myself. You were evaluated every once in a while as to the work that you were doing and the production that you were doing and the amount of scrap that you didn't produce, and that's what you were judged on.
So the better your men worked, the better off.
The better for me.
Try to find a couple questions. This has been really good. You've answered a lot of questions. How about company celebrations or awards or anything that was given out periodically to show?
As I said, during the war, we had a pretty good record on making Navy cable, and we were awarded a Navy E. There was a big, they had admirals and senators, everything down to the Anaconda here. I believe it was around 43, 44, and the Navy E is for excellence. And we were given little pins to put on our coats or jackets for the excellence that we achieved in manufacturing Navy cables. And as I said, in 43 or 44, somewhere around there, the Navy honored us with a Navy E-Day. Now, the individual men, there was no special awards. We had a suggestion program where people that operated machines came up with suggestions that could either improve the quality of the cable that they were making or could increase the production. They were given awards. The people on the machines were given awards, and they were money awards, outright money awards.
How often did something like that happen?
Oh, that happened when the program, when the program goes into effect, everybody's all head up about it. And, there was a lot of, at the beginning, I would say 10 to 15 a week improvements were made where people were getting awards. And naturally, as the program continues, it sort of dies out because there's only so many things that you can improve.
Like what kind of things would people want to improve at the company?
Well, the quality of the cable, the ways of making it cheaper, making the cable as well, but not making it faster, increasing production. As I said, quality. less scrap. If you found a way to make cable, you'd be surprised, like somebody would make it. When you start up a machine, there's a certain amount of scrap you make until you get the cable to the way you want. Or you may run 15, 20 feet of a copper wire that would be scrap. Now, if somebody would come up with an idea where you'd only have to make, say, 5 feet of scrap instead of 15 or 20 feet of scrap, now they're saving 10 feet of cable, and you're making less scrap. Now, that would be a suggestion that would be taken into consideration for a prize. If there was an area where things were not doing too well, and somebody would go in there and look the situation over and come up with an idea of how we can make that product better, and they would try it, and if it worked, that would be an award. Things like that.
How about, what was the relationship of higher up officials in the company to the town? Did they hold political office? Did they have any influence on the town?
Very few. The only man that I could remember is, I think, who was our manager and after a while became an executive up on the 3rd floor, was Mr. Whitaker, who was an official in Hastings Building and Loan. But insofar as politics in the community, none of them ever got involved with that.
Would you consider Hastings a company town where many people worked for Anaconda?
At that particular time, I would consider that, because there wasn't only Hastings, there wasn't only Anaconda. As I said, it was Anaconda, it was Zinzer's, and there were other small businesses in there. And I would consider it more or less of a working man's town. And people that didn't work in those places, they commuted to New York.
How much, while you were working at Anaconda, how much did it expand? Did they build more buildings?
Yes, they did. They built more buildings, and as I said, when they started to make telephone cable, I think at one time we must have had somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 employees. That's between the North Mill and the South Mill. Now the South Mill is where your strand was made, the copper, our rod mill was there, the copper bars were rolled, and up in the North Mill is where they were making telephone cable and other products, which the strand had to come from the South Mill and transport it up to the North Mill so they could continue with the operation.
What year was that, about 1,500 employees?
I would say there was, you got me, Jim, but
Would you
it
say
was prior to a strike. They went out on strike, and while they were out on strike, the last strike, the telephone cable, the telephone department almost was wiped out after the strike, because they had started to make cable somewhere else, and from that 1,500, we dropped down to about 800 employees. But I'm not sure the year of the strike, but it was somewhere in the 60s. Somewhere in the 60s.
how did this strike affect you?
Didn't affect me or the supervisors that were working there. We used to get down there every day, and somebody had to watch the place. So all we did is put in our time, held meetings, looked at the equipment, turned the it over so it wouldn't rust, and that we made cable. But we were more or less as watchdogs protecting the equipment.
How long did the strike last, do you remember?
Last about a year.
And people started to lose jobs after the strike?
After the strike, a lot of them weren't taken back. They just discontinued some operations. And then, as I said, that's when I thought, that the place was going to be phased out. So after that there, and by 72, I had made up my mind that I was going to get out of there. Of course, I was reaching an age where I could get out. I retired when I was 62 instead of waiting till I was 65. And 3 years after I retired, the place shut completely down.
What was the retirement plan? Would it have helped you to stay that extra 3 years?
No, I think I got out at a time where it was beneficial to me. I got a little better plan than people that stayed at 65 for the other 3 years. Because those that stayed to the end, they had to take whatever the company gave them. When I retired, I had a choice. And the choice that I took was beneficial to me. Some of the fellows that stayed to the end, they didn't have the choice. They had to take what was given to them.
In the north plant, they made the telephone cable.
Right.
Which building was that? How far did the property extend?
Well, that's the building that's right alongside of our railroad station.
Right next to the bridge?
Right next to the bridge. That building was the North Mill.
Okay.
That was the North Mill. Then as you go down south, they had the big high voltage test area. That's the new building, the newest building that was put up.
The silver one?
That's the one, yeah.
Okay.
And then anything beyond that was the South Mill. And that's where your stranders were, your paper insulators, the rod mill, weatherproof cable, all the other stuff was made down in the South Mill.
Okay, during the course that Anaconda was there, they built some buildings while you were there. Did they tear any buildings down, or did they cede any property?
No, the only building that they made was the high voltage cable, the high voltage building, which is still standing. That's the newest building that's in between the North and South Mills. That was the only building that was made. And they didn't tear anything down of any value at all.
So
and neither did they build any new ones down there.
That plant basically stayed the same from, you say, the 30s all the way up in...
I would say pretty much. Pretty much. And that, occasionally you would get a new piece of equipment. We had to get some new equipment to compete with these modern inventions that were coming on. They started to make machines that would draw wire, and as it was being drawn down to a particular size, it would also anneal it, make the wire soft. It had an electric current that went through a wheel, and as the wire was being drawn, it was also being annealed. Now that saved an operation, because everybody wants copper wire to be soft, because when it's hard, it's like a spring. When it's soft, it's pliable. And when it's pliable, it can be used for many things. For other operations, for drawing, or for stranding. You would make strand, and then, usually the way copper works is when it's processed, during the processing period, the copper would be soft when you started out. By the time it got finished, it would be hard. Because you're stretching the wire, or you're twisting it, or you're pulling on it, which makes copper wire hard. But then what you would do, you would have to anneal it to make it soft again. because everybody wanted soft wire. So it was pliable.
What years were those when other companies started to give competition?
Oh, they were always in competition. They were always in. They were on a large scale as we were, because they didn't have all the equipment that we had. They would only concentrate on a certain amount of cable or a certain size cable that they would make. And they could make a profit for the simple reason they were probably working in some garage or something and have maybe 3 or 4 pieces of equipment and make a specific kind of cable. Their overhead would be low, and naturally they could outcompete us and they could sell the cable cheaper than we could. Because we had overhead, we had supervisors that had to be paid. The guy that owned that their building probably ran the machines.
Now you talk about the newer technology where they can anneal the copper all in one machine. When did that start to happen?
Oh, I honestly can't tell you, but I'm sure that a lot of this here stuff was in existence probably a good 40, 50 years ago. But by the time it was perfected, and by the time Anaconda decided to go into that there stuff, I would say it would probably be around the 40s and 50s, around there when Anaconda started to use it.
How about kids that grew up in Hastings through the 40s and 50s? Did they aspire to work in the Anaconda? Was that a
Well,
job to have?
a lot of them wound up down there. They may not have aspired to go down there, but you know, like when I came up after the 29s, after the crash, the Wall Street crash, things were tough to get a job. And you went anywhere where you could get a job. And as I said, that's why baseball, nobody had much money, so everybody went up to watch the baseball games. It didn't cost nothing. There was no charge to get in. We would pass the hat around, so you could throw whatever you want into the hat, throw a dime, a quarter, or something like that, which would help the team that was playing, and that was like the St. Matthew's Lyceum, I'm not talking Anaconda. I played for the St. Matthew's Lyceum, and that would help us buy bats, baseballs, pay the umpires, and stuff like that from the money that we collected from the spectators.
Did playing baseball, that helped you get a job at the Anaconda?
Well, that's what got me my job, to get down the Anaconda. I would have never went down there, but the fellow that was the superintendent at that particular time, his name was Waldy. He met me in a village and asked me what I was doing, and that particular time I wasn't working. He says, how would you like to come down and we can find a job for you down in the Anaconda, and we're also making up a ball team. I said, that sounded good to me, so I went down there and I was hired. As I said, I thought I'd only spend a year down there, but then the fact of, after being down a while and I was made a supervisor, I got married and started to raise a family, and pretty soon I was pretty well set.
Okay. You have anything else to
No,
say?
nothing more that I can tell you, Jim.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kazura.
All right. Very good. I hope you get what you want.